My name is Maris Ellison, 65. I was folding laundry on a quiet Thursday evening when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I answered almost automatically, expecting a routine call from my daughter Evelyn. Her voice was familiar, bright, and hurried, and I smiled at the sound, thinking of the last time she'd come by with her husband Daniel, laughing at some inside joke I hadn't understood. The conversation started like any other. She asked about dinner plans, mentioned the mail, the bills I had been reminding her to pay. I responded patiently the way a mother does when her child is busy, when her child is living her own life but still needs the tether of reassurance. I said a few encouraging words, laughed lightly at her jokes, and told her I loved her. Then it happened. I heard a click so soft I almost missed it. I assumed she had hung up. But instead of silence, I heard muffled voices not through the speakerphone as before, but closer, sharper, and unmistakable. Evelyn. And then her mother-in-law. My heart lurched. Living with her is hell, Evelyn said, a bitter edge in her voice I had never heard before. I'm only doing it for the house. I froze mid-fold. My hand, still holding a shirt, trembled. I blinked, thinking perhaps I had misheard. But the clarity of her words cut through the kitchen sharp and cold. The hum of the refrigerator, the wind outside, even the soft ticking of the clock faded into a single, unbearable sound. Evelyn speaking about me as if I were nothing, as if every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dollar I had spent on her comfort had been meaningless. A flash of disbelief struck me. My knees went weak, and I gripped the counter for support. The words repeated themselves in my mind like a recording stuck on loop. She wasn't complaining in a private, fleeting moment. She was confiding deliberately casually to her mother-in-law, confirming that she had never valued me for who I am, only for what I provide. My chest tightened, and I felt a strange, hollow ache begin to spread from my sternum outward. I wanted to shout, to collapse, to run, but I did none of those things. I simply stayed frozen, listening to my own child describe me in terms I could hardly comprehend. I remembered the mortgage I had taken on to buy this house, the bills I had covered, the food I had bought, the gifts, the constant support through her failed projects and endless requests. Every memory I cherished now felt like a stepping stone in a path paved with my own naivety. Her laugh followed light and cruel, cutting through the tension like a knife. She sounded as if she had always known the truth, that she had never respected or loved me beyond the comforts I provided. And in that laugh I heard something else. Certainty, a sharp delight in the knowledge that she could speak this way, unchallenged, without a single hesitation. I sank onto the kitchen chair, still gripping the shirt in my hands. My vision blurred slightly, and the laundry I had been folding lay forgotten, a small monument to the ordinary life that had just been shattered. I thought of the countless nights I had stayed up helping her with work, of the groceries I had carried home, of every act of love and guidance I had offered, and realized that for her, it had been transactional, a means to an end. The silence that followed her words was louder than any noise. My phone sat between us, innocuous, ordinary, betraying. My mind raced through every interaction, every smile, every gentle correction I had given, replaying them in a new, harsher light. For the first time in my life, I saw her clearly, not as the daughter I raised, but as someone calculating, indifferent, and willing to reduce me to my utility. I stayed like that for a long while, breathing shallowly, letting the words sink in. Outside, the wind rustled the trees. Inside my own home felt unfamiliar, a stage where I had unknowingly played the role she never appreciated. The evening stretched heavy and quiet, as I slowly began to understand that nothing would ever be the same again. I stayed seated in the kitchen chair, long after the words had stopped my hands resting limply on the folded laundry. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock. Even the occasional creak from the old floorboards, all of it seemed amplified, echoing the hollow ache in my chest. Evelyn's voice, sharp and casual, haunted me in ways that made my stomach twist. I could still hear her laugh, a sound that once brought warmth, now a cruel reminder of everything I hadn't known. I thought of the nights I had stayed awake to help her with school projects, then later with job applications and business plans. I remembered the early mornings brewing coffee and packing lunches long before her husband Daniel even entered her life. Every dollar I had spent on groceries, every extra utility bill I covered, every repair in the house that she and her little family enjoyed, I had done without complaint. And yet, in an instant, those sacrifices felt hollow, as if they had only served a purpose I hadn't realized, to pad her sense of entitlement, to buy her comfort, while eroding the respect I thought we shared. The memories came faster than I could process. I remembered the winter she begged for a laptop to finish her freelance work. I had gone to 3 different stores before finding the right one, wrapping it carefully, and watched her grin as she tore through the paper. I had felt pride then, imagining she was grateful. Now I wondered if that smile had ever been genuine. Perhaps it had only been an acknowledgement of a debt she assumed she could collect indefinitely. I shivered involuntarily, but not entirely from the cold. It was the realization that for all those years, my love and care had been invisible, appreciated only inasmuch as it served her. I tried to push the thought away, tried to remember that love wasn't transactional, that parenthood was about sacrifice and patience. But the clarity of her words refused to fade. She had not whispered her resentment in a moment of frustration. She had spoken openly, confidently to her mother-in-law without the slightest hesitation. The casual cruelty stung more than any overt insult ever could. I pulled the folded laundry closer, hugging it like a fragile barrier against the surge of emotion. My body felt heavy, drained, as though the betrayal had drained the color from the room. I thought about the house I had bought for them, the one that had seemed like a dream, a place where my daughter and her small family could grow, where Daniel could settle in comfortably, where Evelyn could finally have stability. It now felt like a stage I had built for someone else to perform upon a space where my role had been defined only by my resources, not by my presence or care. I couldn't bring myself to cry, not yet. The tears would betray more than grief. They would admit defeat, and I was not ready for that. Instead, I let the cold reality settle in my mind, tracing the arc of every interaction I had had with Evelyn over the past decades. Every compliment I had given, every hug, every moment I had thought we were connecting, I now questioned. Had she ever truly valued me, or had I only been a convenience, a safety net she knew she could always count on? Even as the kitchen grew darker with the waning light, I remained there frozen, letting each thought cut as sharply as the last. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, a reminder that life continued indifferent to my heartbreak. And yet inside, time had slowed each second, stretching into an eternity, as I grappled with the staggering weight of revelation. I knew I had to move eventually, to step away from the chair and the silence to perform the motions of my life once more. But for now, I allowed myself to sit with it, to feel the chill, the shock, and the raw tremor of betrayal. Each pulse of my heart was a reminder that I was still alive, still present, still capable of facing whatever came next, even if that meant rethinking everything I had believed about love, loyalty, and family. I woke to the familiar scent of brewing coffee and the soft glow of morning sunlight filtering through the kitchen blinds. For a moment, I let myself pretend the night's revelation hadn't happened, that everything was ordinary as it had always seemed in these walls. I moved quietly, filling the kettle and setting it on the stove, arranging the breakfast table with practiced care. The eggs, toast, and fruit were ready before Evelyn and Daniel shuffled down the stairs, their voices bright but forced. Evelyn's laugh sounded different in daylight. Lighter, yes, but somehow clipped, calculated. She greeted me with a casual smile, leaning into Daniel, as if to reinforce a front I could almost believe if I wanted to. Daniel nodded at me politely, murmuring something about the morning paper, and slipped into a chair without looking directly at my face. Lydia appeared moments later carrying a shopping bag and chatting about the neighbor's new car. Her voice was cheerful, too bright, too deliberate, each laugh ringing hollow. I moved through the motions, pouring coffee, passing plates, but my attention was elsewhere. I watched their hands, their eyes, their subtle shifts in posture. Lydia's fingers lingered on the edge of the counter, as though she was claiming the space. Daniel's gaze flicked nervously toward the table, and Evelyn's thumbs danced across her phone, even as she sipped her coffee. Every detail I had once overlooked now felt like a deliberate signal, a small performance hiding intentions I had only begun to suspect. I recalled the countless mornings I had done this same routine with them, the rhythm of breakfast and conversation, the small talk that once felt natural. I remembered moments of warmth, too, Evelyn sharing a smile when I had surprised her with her favorite breakfast, Daniel complimenting a perfectly brewed cup of coffee, Lydia chatting casually about the garden. Those memories now seemed tainted, overlaid with suspicion, each one a thread in a pattern I had failed to see. The house itself felt different in the light of day. Shadows in corners that had never seemed threatening before now held a quiet tension. The hum of the refrigerator and the clatter of dishes sounded sharper against the undercurrent of my awareness. I moved deliberately, keeping my face calm, my voice steady, passing the toast to Evelyn, placing a mug before Daniel, acknowledging Lydia's chatter with nods and light responses. I was performing as well, masking the turmoil that churned beneath my ribs. Evelyn scrolled quickly through her phone, pausing only to take small sips of coffee. Daniel glanced toward her screen, a small frown appearing before he masked it with a shrug. Lydia arranged her shopping, inspecting the contents with an air of casual authority. None of them noticed me watching. None of them realized that I was cataloging every gesture, every glance, every small movement. I had become an observer in my own home, quietly mapping the currents beneath the surface of what they presented as family life. By the time breakfast ended, I had memorized patterns, traced the subtle cues of tension, and noted the times Evelyn's attention wavered from conversation to device. I washed the dishes with methodical care, every movement precise, as if choreographing a dance I had not rehearsed but had been forced to master in a single night. My hands were steady, my face composed, but my mind raced, cataloging the details, tracing the outlines of a truth I was only beginning to grasp. Even as the morning progressed, the house felt unfamiliar, a stage set for performances I could no longer fully trust. I moved through it with careful observation, ready to play the role they expected, while quietly preparing for the confrontation I knew I would need to have. The scent of fresh paint and polished wood filled the living room as I traced my fingers over the banister, remembering the day I first stepped into this house. It had been a crisp spring morning in Lexington, just months after Harold passed. The grief had weighed me down, but I had convinced myself that creating a home for Evelyn and her family could offer both of us a fresh start. Every corner, every detail had been chosen with care. The warm oak floors, the sunlit kitchen, the backyard where I imagined her children playing under the maple tree. I wanted stability, a sanctuary, a place where love and family could thrive. I had poured my savings into this house using the inheritance Harold left me and taking on extra loans to make it spacious and comfortable. I had envisioned the family dinners, the laughter echoing through the halls, the quiet moments over morning coffee. I had pictured Evelyn's smile as she moved into her own room, her life unfolding safely under my roof. At the time, I believed this was the ultimate expression of love, the kind of sacrifice that parents make without question. But now, as I sat in the empty living room, the sunlight casting long shadows across the polished floors, the illusion of that love seemed to crumble. Evelyn's words from last night echoed in my mind. Living with her is hell. I'm only doing it for the house. The laughter she had shared with her mother-in-law, casual and confident, cut deeper than any argument ever could. What I had believed to be appreciation, gratitude, or familial closeness now felt like manipulation, carefully hidden behind polite smiles and feigned affection. I remembered the renovations, the trips to furniture stores, the nights spent assembling cribs and setting up playrooms. I had handled the bills, the utilities, and unexpected repairs without complaint, thinking that was simply what families did for each other. I had helped fund Evelyn's fledgling business, covered expenses she claimed she couldn't afford, and indulged small luxuries for her believing it would make her happy. Every act of generosity now appeared calculated, as if my sacrifices were mere currency, exchanged for comfort rather than connection. The backyard, once a symbol of joy and potential, now felt like a stage where I had unknowingly played a part. I had imagined the family sharing quiet mornings with coffee and newspapers, children running across the lawn, laughter spilling into the trees. Instead, I saw a place where my kindness had been taken for granted, where my intentions had been misconstrued or ignored entirely. Each memory of this home, once vivid with love, now felt tinged with disappointment, a testament to how easily generosity could be exploited. I sank into the armchair by the window, the sun warming my shoulders, and let my mind wander through the years I had invested in this house. The late nights, the early mornings, the countless small efforts to make it a haven, all had been done with love. Yet now I questioned their value. Had my sacrifices truly fostered family and happiness? Or had they simply enabled entitlement and disregard? The question lingered as I stared at the quiet rooms, waiting for the answer that would guide the choices I would have to make in the days ahead. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as I moved about, carefully preparing coffee and setting out toast. Evelyn's voice floated down the hall before she even appeared light and airy, but there was something in her tone that made me pause. I had heard it before. Subtle, almost imperceptible, a slight sharpness under the laughter. She was speaking to her mother-in-law, Lydia, whose soft, cheerful responses seemed practiced, deliberate. And if she ever decides to sell the house, we could finally get what's ours, Evelyn said, barely above a whisper, yet clear enough for me to catch. My hands froze mid-motion, the knife I held hovering over the loaf of bread. The words carried a casual ease, as if the discussion of someone else's property were nothing more than small talk. My chest tightened, a familiar ache pressing against my ribs. I realized then that they weren't just gossiping, they were calculating, weighing options, plotting. My daughter, the one I had trusted and nurtured, was treating the house, my home, as a commodity. I moved quietly toward the hallway, pretending to adjust a vase on the counter while listening. Lydia's soft laughter followed Evelyn's words, a reassurance to her daughter-in-law that she understood the plan that she approved. Every nuance, every pause, every careful inflection began to take on meaning. I had seen it before in subtle ways, the fleeting glances, the quick changes of subject when I entered a room, the almost imperceptible shift in tone when they discussed money around me. But hearing it so clearly, so blatantly confirmed my suspicions. I pulled a small notebook from the drawer and began jotting notes, each word weighed and recorded. Evelyn House comment whisper, 8:17 a.m. Lydia chuckle agreement. The act of writing grounded me, gave me a sense of control in a situation that felt increasingly chaotic. I noticed the patterns, the way Evelyn would linger on financial topics, the way Lydia would steer conversations toward property inheritance or future plans, all without giving the impression they were plotting. As they moved into the living room, Evelyn sitting on the sofa, scrolling through her phone, Lydia rearranging throw pillows and glancing at framed family photos. I continued my silent observations. I cataloged their body language, their small gestures, the subtle ways their eyes met and flicked away. The smiles and casual laughter were masks fragile and deliberate. They were performers, and I was finally seeing the choreography behind the scenes. Every interaction, every conversation became a puzzle piece. I recalled last week's incident when Lydia had commented on a neighbor's recently sold property, subtly comparing it to ours. Evelyn had knotted fingers tapping rapidly against her phone, and I had thought nothing of it at the time. Now, in the light of this morning's discovery, the connection was undeniable. By the time they left for the day, I had filled several pages with observations, times, and patterns. Each note strengthened a growing realization that my generosity, my sacrifices, and my trust had been measured, analyzed, and perhaps taken for granted. The house which I had built with love and hope was now a stage for schemes and quiet manipulation. I closed the notebook and let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of what I had uncovered. Every subtle remark, every hushed word had cracked the illusion of harmony, leaving me with a single pressing thought I would need to watch, to record, and to prepare. The days ahead would demand more than patience, they would require strategy. I settled into the living room armchair, coffee mug in hand, and let my eyes drift toward Evelyn. She was seated on the sofa phone, balanced delicately between her ear and shoulder as she typed with rapid, precise movements. Her thumbs danced across the screen, pausing just long enough for a quick glance at me before she returned to whatever invisible task commanded her attention. I noted the way she shifted in her seat weight, alternating from one side to the other, as though unconsciously bracing herself for observation. Daniel lounged nearby, casually flipping through the newspaper, but his eyes flicked toward Evelyn more often than he let on. Lydia moved through the room with practiced ease, adjusting cushions, straightening picture frames, all the while keeping her gaze casual, avoiding mine, but occasionally meeting Evelyn's in fleeting, purposeful glances. Their coordination was subtle, almost imperceptible, but my attention had sharpened in the wake of last week's revelations. Every movement, every small gesture spoke volumes. Evelyn's body language betrayed impatience beneath the polite surface, her laughter a fraction too sharp, too rehearsed. She would occasionally roll her eyes slightly when Lydia's attention wandered, or tilt her head, a micro-expression I recognized from years of watching children navigate social games. It was a pattern I had memorized without realizing it, the slight flick of an eyebrow, the barely audible sigh, the way her fingers lingered over the screen, as if guarding something. Lydia's behavior complemented Evelyn's seamlessly. She acted busy, but there was a rhythm to her motions that suggested coordination rather than spontaneity. I noted the way she subtly guided conversation toward topics of money, property, or potential inheritance, always careful to frame it innocently, as if it were ordinary discussion. Her gestures were small, a hand brushing over the edge of the table, a tilt of the head, a fleeting glance that lasted just long enough to signal understanding. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting each detail register. The conversation they carried on light and superficial in tone was layered with subtext. Evelyn's responses were almost mechanical nods, timed perfectly to Lydia's cues. Every laugh, every casual remark seemed calculated to conceal purpose. It was a performance, and I was the only one aware of the script behind the smiles. I reached for my notebook, flipping to a fresh page. Evelyn phone posture. 10:15 a.m. Subtle eye roll, I wrote. Lydia glanced toward sofa. 10:16 a.m. Reinforces posture. Each entry formed a map of hidden intentions, subtle alliances, and the unspoken hierarchy in this room. I realized that what I had assumed was ordinary family interaction was in fact a carefully orchestrated play, one in which I had unknowingly been the audience for years, never recognizing the cues until now. The more I observed, the more I understood the patterns. Small remarks that had seemed insignificant in the past. Questions about bills, comments on our home, casual inquiries into my work schedule were threads weaving a larger tapestry of control and manipulation. They were testing boundaries, gauging reactions, assessing what they could take for granted. By the time Evelyn stood to fetch a glass of water, I had filled another page with observations. I let the notebook rest on my lap and watched silently, cataloging, connecting dots, preparing. The play was ongoing, each act carefully executed, but for the first time, I was aware of the entire stage. I would watch, I would learn, and when the moment came, I would know exactly how to step in. Later that afternoon, I found myself in the quiet of my home office, the hum of the computer, and the distant ticking of the wall clock filling the space. I had decided to go through the files I had kept tucked away in the drawer, statements, receipts, and old bills I had long assumed were routine. My fingers hesitated as I opened the first envelope, half expecting nothing unusual, half bracing for confirmation of the unease that had been growing in my chest. The first few pages were mundane utility bills, grocery receipts, routine payments. But as I flipped through the stack, my heart began to pick up pace. There were unfamiliar charges, small at first, easily dismissed consulting fees, online transfers, purchases I didn't recognize. A dinner at a steakhouse I had never visited, nearly $500. Boutique clothing labeled in Evelyn's name, $2,000. Subscriptions I didn't recall signing up for. Each line made me pause, a jolt, running through me as I connected it to the offhand remarks and subtle glances I had observed earlier. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. These weren't isolated incidents. They formed a pattern, a trail. I pulled out my notebook and began recording each anomaly. Dates, amounts, descriptions, every detail mattered. I noted Evelyn's name appearing again and again, always associated with transactions that I had assumed were household-related expenses. The realization hit me slowly, painfully. The money I had set aside to support my family, to maintain the home, and help Evelyn get on her feet, was being diverted in ways I hadn't sanctioned. As I continued digging, I came across statements showing transfers from my savings account to accounts I didn't recognize. My stomach twisted at the sight of the amounts, thousands of dollars repeated over several months, each one labeled vaguely, consulting fee, miscellaneous expense. I could trace the timing back to moments when Evelyn had mentioned new projects or purchases, and suddenly all those casual mentions, all those offhand comments about needing funds, seemed deliberate. I felt a cold surge of disbelief mixed with anger. How had I not noticed this sooner? The meticulousness, the casual confidence with which the money had been rerouted, it was audacious, and it left a sting sharper than any harsh words. I thought of the trust I had placed in her, the countless nights I had worried about her, the mornings I had ensured she had everything she needed before tending to my own life. And now I realized that trust had been exploited, a lifeline stretched too far, and taken for granted. I sank back into the chair, clutching a pen and notebook, the weight of the discovery pressing down on me. Lydia's subtle guidance. Evelyn's careful remarks, the little signals I had cataloged, they were not trivial. They were part of a larger orchestration, a play in which the lines were financial as much as emotional. Every minor discrepancy added to the bigger picture, revealing intentions that had previously remained invisible. The room felt colder now, the afternoon light harsher against the desktop, and I knew that I could not ignore what I had found. The evidence was there, undeniable in its detail. Each statement, each transfer, each note of a forgotten expense was a marker of a reality I could no longer overlook. I closed the last envelope slowly, my hands still trembling slightly, and stared at the stack before me. It was more than numbers on paper. It was proof that my generosity had been taken as a given, that my trust had been tested and in many ways abused. I set the envelopes neatly back in the drawer, but the notebook remained open on my lap, filled with observations and calculations. I would continue watching, recording, and planning. The play was far from over, and now I held the knowledge I needed to navigate it. The morning light spilled into the kitchen warm and golden, but I felt a chill as I moved through the familiar routine. I poured coffee into mugs, arranged plates, and smiled as Evelyn and Daniel came down the stairs. Evelyn's laugh was light and airy, exactly as it always had been, yet somehow sharper, now a little too precise. Daniel nodded politely, glancing briefly at me before turning his attention to the newspaper. Lydia followed, carrying a shopping bag and commenting on the weather, her voice a practiced cheerfulness that barely concealed a knowing edge. I went through the motions, passing toast to Evelyn, coffee to Daniel, and acknowledging Lydia's chatter with polite nods. Every gesture, every movement I executed deliberately rehearsed in silence. The house smelled like breakfast, normal and ordinary, but my mind was calculating, cataloging, observing. I could watch without revealing my awareness, maintaining the mask of calm while piecing together the behavior I had been studying for days. Evelyn scrolled through her phone as she sipped her coffee, her thumbs flying over the screen. Each glance at me, each flicker of expression was a signal I now understood how to read. Lydia adjusted her shopping bag, subtly leaning toward Evelyn, as though confirming a shared thought, her eyes darting to the counter in fleeting acknowledgement of something unspoken. Daniel moved casually, pretending to be absorbed in the newspaper, yet I noticed how his gaze lingered, measuring alert. All of it formed a pattern, a choreography that had gone unnoticed for too long. I reflected on the years before, when I had trusted completely, when Evelyn's small achievements or failures had shaped my own focus and attention. I had celebrated her successes with unguarded pride, covered expenses without question, and indulged her whims, believing that this was my role as a mother. I remembered the countless evenings spent helping with projects, the trips to stores for supplies. She insisted she needed the quiet nights worrying about bills she claimed were overdue. And now, in hindsight, the small favors, the gentle nudges, the silent support, I could see them differently. Each act, once motivated by love, now seemed entwined with expectation, taken as a given rather than appreciated. I moved through the kitchen, deliberately washing dishes, while keeping my eyes on the group. I noted every subtle cue, the way Evelyn hesitated before speaking, the way Lydia's hands lingered on the countertop when passing something, Daniel's barely perceptible tightening of his jaw when he thought I wasn't watching. I cataloged these observations mentally, connecting them to the financial discrepancies I had uncovered. The statements, the transfers, the unfamiliar charges, all aligned with the patterns of behavior I was now seeing unfold in real time. The normal rhythm of breakfast ended, plates stacked and dishes washed, but the sense of watchfulness remained. I felt the weight of information pressing down, yet I maintained my composure, moving carefully through the motions of family life. My silence was deliberate, protective, a shield and a weapon at once. I could gather the evidence, observe the intentions, and prepare for the moment when I would no longer pretend. Until then, every word, every gesture, every small detail was a piece of the puzzle I intended to solve. By the time they left the kitchen, I set the sponge down slowly and wiped my hands, letting my gaze linger on the empty table. I was calm outwardly, but inside, a strategy was forming, built on observation, calculation, and the quiet certainty that the house, my home, and my decisions would not be taken from me again. I had avoided the office all morning, telling myself there was no reason to confront the chaos of thoughts swirling in my head, but the unease would not relent. Slowly, I pushed open the drawer where I kept the important documents, statements, contracts, receipts, all neatly stacked in folders labeled with dates and descriptions. My fingers trembled slightly as I rifled through them, half expecting nothing. Half expecting confirmation of the suspicions that had been building over the past days. At first, the papers seemed ordinary. Utility agreements, old tax forms, a few receipts for repairs and groceries. I exhaled slowly, allowing a flicker of relief to settle before the next folder drew my attention. That's when I saw it, a preliminary contract dated just a few weeks ago, bearing signatures I hadn't recognized at first. Evelyn's name was there, along with Daniel's, and there was a notary stamp confirming its authenticity. My stomach twisted as I read the details. The house, my home, was being leveraged, potentially sold, without my consent. The paper felt heavy in my hands, more than ink on a page. Years of trust, sacrifice, and careful planning suddenly felt fragile, as if a single misstep could undo everything I had built. I scanned the document again, checking for errors, for some loophole that would make it invalid, anything to lessen the sting. There was none. Every line, every clause confirmed that Evelyn and Daniel had quietly arranged something significant, treating my property as though it belonged to them. I sank into the chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down. My mind raced through the possibilities. Had Lydia been involved in guiding them? Had the casual remarks and glances, the subtle nudges toward financial discussion, been part of this plan? My notebook, filled with observations from the past week, suddenly seemed more valuable than ever. The small gestures, the offhand comments, the carefully timed distractions, all pieces of a puzzle that now had a clear and alarming image. I went through the contract line by line, annotating, making notes. Every clause seemed intentional, designed to protect their interests while leaving me with little control. It was audacious, calculated, and cruel. For years, I had been the one to ensure their comfort, to pay the bills, to keep the household running smoothly. And now, without warning, they had moved to seize what I had worked for, treating my generosity as a resource to be leveraged. The living room felt colder suddenly, the afternoon light casting sharp angles across the polished floors. I leaned back, letting the paper rest in my lap, staring at it as though the ink itself might dissolve and undo the betrayal. But the truth was undeniable. The house I had built, the place I had envisioned as a sanctuary and a stage for family, was no longer solely mine in intention, if not yet in possession. I closed the folder carefully, almost reverently, and placed it atop the others. My hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the surge of clarity and resolve that came with knowledge. I would watch. I would gather more information, and I would act. Every glance, every gesture, every subtle remark I had recorded suddenly mattered more than ever. The stakes were no longer abstract. They were immediate, tangible, and deeply personal. I left the office quietly, the preliminary contract safely stored in my bag, and walked toward the kitchen, feeling the familiar rhythm of the house around me. I moved as if nothing had changed, but inside, everything had shifted. The morning air was crisp as I drove through Lexington, the streets familiar yet strangely foreign, as though the city itself had shifted while I slept. I parked in front of a small, understated office tucked between a cafe and a bookstore. The brass nameplate read, Hawthorne and Gray Attorneys at Law. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, adjusted my scarf, and stepped out my steps, deliberate measured. There was no room for hesitation today. Inside the office smelled of polished wood and faint coffee, a quiet hum of activity from clerks typing behind glass partitions. A young woman with glasses greeted me and directed me to a small waiting area. Minutes later, the lawyer arrived, Ms. Clara Hawthorne, mid-40s, sharp eyes that seemed to absorb every detail. She extended her hand firm but reassuring and gestured toward the desk. I settled into the chair across from her, unfolding the folder I had brought the preliminary contract and bank statements tucked neatly inside. Clara opened her notebook pen poised and waited patiently as I recounted the past few weeks, Evelyn's overheard words, Lydia's subtle guidance, the pattern of transactions, and now the contract I had discovered. I did not embellish. I let the facts speak, leaving my emotions contained, measured, though the tension in my chest was unmistakable. Clara listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, her expression composed, neutral. When I finished, she leaned back slightly and tapped her pen against her notebook. You have a few avenues, she said quietly. First, you need to secure your legal ownership. Any preliminary contracts or agreements signed without your consent are not automatically enforceable, but documentation is key. Second, your financial assets related to this property need protection. We can establish separate accounts, assign access controls, and if necessary, freeze transfers until you confirm authorization. Third, you should prepare for direct confrontation in a controlled setting, ideally with legal oversight, to ensure nothing can be disputed later. Her calm, methodical explanation offered clarity I had not expected. Each step was practical, precise, achievable. I asked questions mostly about timing, how to handle Evelyn or Lydia if they tried to manipulate or intimidate me, and how to ensure the house remained mine without exposing myself to unnecessary risk. Clara answered each carefully, providing strategies and contingencies, emphasizing documentation, written notices, and legally binding safeguards. I realized as I listened that this was a turning point. The house, the property I had envisioned as a sanctuary and a space for love, could now become a shield of security, a structure I could defend, not just emotionally, but legally. I felt a flicker of relief mixed with determination. The knowledge that there was a clear path forward, rules, protections, enforceable measures, gave me a sense of agency I had not felt in weeks. By the end of the meeting, we had drafted an initial plan opening a new savings account under my sole control, restricting access to the existing accounts tied to household expenses, sending preliminary notices regarding the contract to Evelyn and Daniel, and preparing a comprehensive record of all relevant transactions. Clara also advised on discreet monitoring of future financial movements, ensuring no unexpected activity could bypass my control. I left the office with a folder thicker than the one I had brought, filled with instructions forms and checklists. The autumn light had shifted, warming the sidewalks as I walked to my car. I ran my hand over the folder, feeling the weight of preparation, of strategy, of steps that could finally translate my anger, disbelief, and hurt into actionable defense. The drive home was quiet, each stoplight a moment to plan my next steps, to anticipate Evelyn's possible reactions, to imagine the confrontation I would orchestrate carefully, deliberately, without losing composure. For the first time since that fateful call, I felt a cautious, precise control, returning not over their actions, but over my own, and that I realized was the start of reclaiming everything that had been at risk. The table was set meticulously, every plate, fork, and glass aligned with precision. The aroma of roasted chicken mingled with a hint of herbs and butter, and the warm glow of the chandelier cast soft light across the polished surface. Evelyn moved about the kitchen with practiced ease, her laughter light almost melodic as she poured wine and offered slices of bread. Daniel followed, nodding politely at each gesture, while Lydia busied herself arranging the centerpiece, smiling in a way that seemed effortless, yet measured. I took my seat at the head of the table, my hands resting lightly on the edge, my posture calm and deliberate. I had spent hours preparing not food this time, but observation. Each movement, each glance, each tone of voice would be noted in my mind, cataloged for later reflection. I could feel the tension beneath the surface of their smiles, subtle but unmistakable, like the tremor of a stringed instrument just before a note breaks. Evelyn leaned slightly toward Lydia as she served the salad, lowering her voice just enough that I could hear the rhythm, the cadence of their conversation. They spoke of trivial matters, neighbors' weekend plans, upcoming events, but I recognized the hidden undertones, the subtle nudges about the house, the finances, the things I had been quietly monitoring for weeks. Every casual remark carried a double meaning, every laugh a hint of complicity. Daniel cleared his throat softly as he passed the gravy, his eyes flicking to Evelyn and Lydia, and then away again. I could see the careful dance, the choreography they believed was invisible. But I was fully aware of every step. Each sip of wine, each gesture, each brief pause had significance, and I let it register in my mind. Lydia complimented the table setting, and Evelyn responded with a small laugh, brushing off the remark with a casual, "Oh, it was nothing." But the subtle exchange, the way their eyes met over the salad bowl, spoke volumes. They were rehearsing kindness, masking their intentions beneath the veneer of civility. I noted it all, every micro-expression and fleeting glance. As the meal continued, I observed the rhythm of their movements and speech. Evelyn's fingers hovered over her phone intermittently, scrolling with purpose, yet maintaining an outward appearance of engagement. Lydia's hands lingered near the centerpiece, adjusting a candle or straightening a napkin with exaggerated nonchalance. Daniel remained polite, his gestures minimal, his attention carefully measured. The dinner was not just a meal. It was a performance, and I had become the only person in the room fully conscious of the stage. I ate slowly, deliberately, maintaining my composure. Every sip of wine, every bite of chicken was deliberate part of a carefully measured rhythm designed to conceal my awareness. My mind cataloged the patterns I had observed over weeks, the subtle alignment of their gestures, the timing of their glances, the silent signals that spoke of plans they thought were hidden. By the time dessert arrived, I had compiled a full mental record. Each word, each gesture, each glance formed a tapestry I could now read with clarity. The dinner, with all its surface charm, had revealed much more than I had expected. I realized then that I would not confront them immediately. The moment had to be precise, deliberate, and entirely under my control. As they lingered over coffee and conversation, I sipped mine calmly, eyes scanning, mind calculating. Every laugh, every casual remark, every fleeting glance was a thread I would later weave into the strategy that would finally reclaim what was mine. The dining room smelled of roasted chicken and fresh bread, yet it felt heavier tonight, as if the air itself were bracing for something unspoken. I placed my hands flat on the table, steadying myself against the surge of nerves that had been building all day. Evelyn passed the gravy to Daniel, her fingers brushing his, lightly, a casual gesture hiding its weight. Lydia smiled at her daughter-in-law, a soft, approving tilt of her head. Everything appeared ordinary, but I could feel the tension coiled tightly beneath their polished exteriors. I cleared my throat lightly, drawing their attention. Before we continue, I said evenly, "There's something I'd like to share." My voice was calm, measured, betraying nothing of the storm I had contained for weeks. Evelyn's eyes flicked toward me, a fleeting question in the curve of her eyebrows. Daniel's hand paused mid-gravy, and Lydia's smile faltered ever so slightly. From my pocket, I retrieved the small recording device, placing it conspicuously in the center of the table. I pressed play. At first, only the soft hum of static filled the room. Then Evelyn's voice came through, casual, confident, and entirely unguarded. "Living with her is hell. I'm only doing it for the house." The words hit like a hammer against the polished oak, reverberating through the quiet room. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. Then Lydia's hand trembled as she reached for the salt shaker, her eyes widening. Evelyn's phone slipped slightly in her hand, her thumb frozen mid-scroll. Daniel lowered his gaze, clearing his throat awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the unfolding reality. The sound of the recording played again, the second round of her laughter echoing unnervingly light but cruel, confirming the deliberate nature of the comment. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. My gaze swept across each of them, calm but unwavering. "Do you recognize your voices?" I asked quietly. No accusation, only observation. I let the tension settle, letting the words hang between us like a suspended weight. Evelyn's mouth opened, then closed. She swallowed, searching for a casual deflection, but none came. Lydia's hands clenched briefly, then relaxed, betraying her attempt at composure. Daniel's jaw tensed, and he shifted in his seat, looking anywhere but at me. The air was taut with unspoken acknowledgement. I pressed the stop button on the device, the abrupt silence hitting the room like a shutter snapping shut. I could see the rapid calculations behind their eyes, the rapid reassessment of their positions, the faint panic that flitted across expressions they usually masked so well. I allowed my own composure to remain untouched, a steady anchor in the storm. For a moment, we simply sat in that silence. Each of them was confronted with a truth they had assumed I would never witness, a reality that stripped away their casual pretense. Evelyn's hands clenched slightly in her lap. Lydia's knuckles whitened on the tabletop, and Daniel exhaled slowly, as if trying to release the tension that pressed against him from every direction. I reached for the preliminary contract I had discovered days ago and set it beside the device, the papers angled to catch the soft light. I didn't need to speak. The message was clear. The house, my home, the center of their casual manipulations, was now surrounded by evidence they could no longer deny. Every transaction, every whispered remark, every subtle glance that had seemed inconsequential now aligned in a single, undeniable narrative. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice quieter than usual, tinged with disbelief. I didn't think you'd hear that," she stammered. Lydia tried to intervene, a quick, light laugh, but it faltered under the weight of what had been revealed. Daniel shifted again, silent, but tense, aware that their private conversation had been transformed into undeniable proof. I watched them carefully, letting each reaction register. The confrontation was not violent, not loud, but the tension was sharp and absolute. I let my gaze linger steady and unyielding, giving them the space to absorb the truth. The recording had done its work. The hidden intentions, the casual cruelty, the manipulation, all of it exposed. As I leaned back slightly in my chair, the room remained hushed. They were left to reckon with the reality of their own words and actions, a quiet but powerful moment of reckoning. And for the first time, I felt the scales begin to shift. The knowledge, the evidence, and my composure had created a moment where the truth could no longer be ignored. The air in the dining room was heavy, thick, with the residue of last night's revelations. The preliminary contract lay before me on the table, crisp, official, and damning in its implications. Evelyn sat across from me, her fingers drumming lightly against the wood, a nervous tick I had never noticed before. Lydia perched on the edge of her chair, her eyes flicking from me to Evelyn, then back again, as if seeking some silent reassurance that everything could still be contained. Daniel leaned back slightly, hands folded silent, his posture tight, betraying the tension he tried to disguise. I took a deep breath and reached for the contract. The paper felt heavier in my hands than it had in the folder at the lawyer's office. It was more than ink and signatures. It was an attempt to claim my home, my security, the culmination of months of quiet planning that I had just uncovered. The legal weight of it mattered less than the symbolism, the assertion of a future I could still control. I slid the pages across the table toward me and began to read aloud, slowly, deliberately. I traced each clause with a finger, letting Evelyn and Lydia hear the details, the clauses that showed how they intended to leverage my house without my consent. Their faces tightened, the casual masks they had worn for weeks cracking. I paused at the section, detailing signatures and dates, letting the room absorb the magnitude of their disregard. Evelyn opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. My voice was calm, unwavering. I have watched, I have listened, and I have gathered the facts, I said. Each word cut through the polite pretense they had relied on. This contract is not valid, and you will not proceed without my consent. I pressed the pen I had brought for official purposes onto the table, a silent assertion of authority, a reminder that legality and control were now firmly in my hands. Then slowly, deliberately, I tore the contract. The crisp ripping echoed in the quiet room louder than I expected, and each shred fell like a statement of independence. Evelyn's eyes widened, and a faint color drained from Lydia's face. Daniel's jaw tightened, and he exhaled through his nose as if to steady himself against the sudden shift in power. I felt a surge of relief mingled with the old ache of betrayal and the thrill of reclaiming what had always been mine. I stacked the torn pieces carefully into a folder, not out of sentimentality, but to preserve evidence to document that the action was deliberate, lawful, and controlled. Every small detail mattered. This was not a reckless display. It was strategy in motion, a turning point in a game that had long been rigged against me. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice quieter than I expected, tinged with disbelief and defensiveness. "You can't just," she began. But I held her gaze calm and immovable, letting the unspoken accusation linger. Lydia tried to interject a soft laugh and attempt to diffuse, but it faltered under the weight of the moment. Daniel shifted again, frowning, slightly silent, but tense, aware that their private designs had been exposed and dismantled before they could act. I pushed back in my chair, letting the clarity of my position sink into the room. The contract was gone, shredded, symbolic and legal at once. The house, my home, the space I had built and maintained, was no longer a lever for someone else's ambitions. I could see the ripple of realization spreading across their faces, the shift from control to uncertainty. For the first time in weeks, the tension I had carried inside began to ease slightly. I allowed myself a slow exhale, feeling the weight of years of subservience and quiet compliance lift, replaced by deliberate authority. The torn contract lay between us, a clear declaration I was no longer a passive participant in the orchestration of my home, my finances, or my life. I gathered the pieces into the folder, leaving the table as still as I had entered it. Evelyn, Lydia, and Daniel remained seated, processing the reality that one decisive act had redrawn the boundaries, reshaping the landscape of control that had once been theirs. The moment was complete, firm, final, and undeniably mine. The morning sun cast a soft, pale light across the living room, highlighting the polished floors and the neatly arranged furniture. The house was quiet, almost unbearably so, but I felt a strange sense of anticipation threading through the stillness. Outside, the car engine hummed a subtle announcement that today was the day the house would finally be mine again. Not just in theory, but in practice. Evelyn stepped out first, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Daniel close behind with boxes stacked carefully in his arms. Lydia lingered near the doorway, adjusting a scarf and straightening her coat, as if preparing for some final performance. I watched them all motionless, cataloging every movement, every glance, every pause that spoke volumes about their awareness of the shift in power. Evelyn glanced at me briefly, a flicker of something unrecognizable passing over her face. Perhaps regret, perhaps irritation, perhaps just calculation. Daniel kept his eyes forward, muscles taut, hands gripping the steering wheel as if bracing for judgment. Lydia, always the poised one, maintained her composure outwardly, but the slight tightening of her jaw betrayed her. They were leaving, but the echoes of their presence, words, laughter, subtle manipulations still lingered in the corners of the rooms. I followed them to the car, standing on the porch, with my hands folded calmly in front of me. The pile of boxes, suitcases, and carefully packed belongings seemed surreal, a tangible representation of weeks of deception, subtle betrayals, and careful observation. Every step they took was measured cautious, as if they sensed that my patience and strategy were no longer passive. Evelyn slid into the passenger seat, Daniel behind the wheel. Lydia lingered a moment longer, offering a polite nod, a faint smile, before she stepped back and closed the door with a soft click that resonated through the quiet morning. The car pulled forward, the tires rolling over the gravel driveway, leaving a stillness behind that was both foreign and comforting. I remained on the porch long after the vehicle disappeared around the corner. The emptiness of the house felt strange, the usual creaks and subtle noises now amplified, but there was a security in the silence. For the first time in months, the house belonged entirely to me. Every room, every corner, every object was unclaimed, free from manipulation or scrutiny. It was my sanctuary again, restored not by negotiation, but by careful observation, legal guidance, and decisive action. The relief was immediate and visceral. My shoulders, previously tense with months of quiet vigilance, relaxed slightly. My breath, which had carried a subtle edge of apprehension, found steadiness. Yet mingled with that relief was a quiet grief, a sense of loss that tugged at the edges of my chest. The family I had tried to nurture, to protect, and to support had chosen a path that separated them from me, and though their absence restored the house, it could not erase the memories of shared meals, quiet conversations, and moments of warmth now tainted by betrayal. I stepped inside, closing the front door carefully behind me. The silence was profound, yet it carried a strange comfort, a reminder that while freedom had come at the cost of their presence, I had reclaimed control of my home, my life, and my peace. I walked through the rooms, touching the furniture, opening the windows to let in the morning air, and allowed myself to feel the balance of loss and liberation settling around me. The house was silent in a way I had never known. No footsteps on the hardwood, no laughter echoing from the kitchen, no Evelyn's phone buzzing with constant notifications. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling beams punctuated the quiet. I sat on the edge of my bed, hands resting lightly on my knees, listening to the emptiness letting it wash over me. At first, the silence felt heavy, almost oppressive, as if it demanded I confront the full weight of the past weeks. Memories surfaced unbidden, the overheard conversation, the subtle manipulations, the financial betrayals, and the contract I had torn apart with deliberate hands. Each recollection brought a sharp edge of anger, a sting of grief, and a tremor of disbelief. Yet in that very quiet, the chaos that had lodged itself in my mind began to loosen its grip. I moved slowly through the rooms, touching the surfaces, as though to reassure myself that the spaces were still real, still mine. The living room, once a stage for performances and hidden agendas, now felt expansive and open. The kitchen, where countless meals had been served and observed, smelled faintly of the evening roast I had prepared, yet carried no tension, no expectation, no calculated glance. Even the bedrooms, quiet and orderly, seemed to breathe with a freedom that had been absent for far too long. I poured a small glass of water and leaned against the counter, letting my eyes drift to the backyard. The maple tree stood motionless in the dim light, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. I realized how much of my energy I had devoted to anticipating reactions, to observing patterns, to protecting myself from manipulation. That vigilance had left little room for presence for peace. Now, with the house empty, the weight lifted. The stillness became a kind of affirmation, a permission to breathe, to let the tension drain from my shoulders, to simply exist without calculation. Sitting back in the living room chair, I allowed myself to reflect, not with anger, not with planning, but with awareness. The absence of family was tangible, yet it carried a strange, liberating quality. I could hear my own thoughts clearly, notice my own breathing, and feel the rhythm of life unmediated by anyone else's presence. I was alone, yes, but in that aloneness, I felt control, clarity, and a budding sense of peace. The clock ticked steadily, a quiet companion. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the house settle around me. The empty rooms no longer felt hollow, they felt safe. And for the first time in weeks, perhaps months, I realized that silence could be more than absence. It could be freedom. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. I stepped into the backyard with gloves in hand, the garden tools laid out neatly on the stone bench. For the first time in weeks, I had the luxury of moving slowly, intentionally, without worrying about hidden motives or subtle judgments. This space, once shared and manipulated, was now entirely mine. I began clearing the overgrown beds, pulling weeds that had taken root while attention had been elsewhere. Each root I pulled felt like a small act of reclamation, a removal of what had choked the life from this corner of the yard. The soil crumbled softly beneath my fingers, pliable and ready, and I could feel a pulse of possibility in the earth itself. Maris placed new seedlings carefully in the freshly turned soil, bright marigolds, lavender, and small roses. Each plant was a deliberate choice, a symbol of renewal and growth. As I patted the earth around the roots, I thought about the months of tension, the subtle betrayals, the patterns I had observed and documented. Here, I could transform the traces of neglect and manipulation into something vibrant and alive. I hung a small wind chime on the pergola, its delicate tones shifting with the breeze, filling the yard with soft, gentle music. The sound carried through the garden, intertwining with the faint hum of bees and the distant rustle of trees. It felt like a signal, a quiet celebration of autonomy and control, a mark of a life being claimed anew. I stepped back, surveying the work so far. The beds were lined, the seedlings nestled securely, and the air seemed lighter, freer. I set a small chair beneath the maple tree, placing a worn cushion for comfort. Here, I could sit, read, reflect, or simply watch the seasons shift without interference. The garden was no longer a backdrop for others' ambitions. It was a space that reflected my choices, my rhythm, and my care. As the sun rose higher, warming my shoulders, I realized that this transformation was more than physical. Each planted seed, each cleared bed, each careful adjustment was a testament to resilience, a way to reclaim a sense of self that had been overshadowed by manipulation. The garden, once ordinary, had become a sanctuary, a personal declaration that life and my home could flourish on my terms. The phone buzzed lightly on the counter, the screen lighting up with Evelyn's name. My hand hovered over it for a moment, steady, deliberate. I picked it up, listening to the familiar ringtone, feeling the familiar rush of tension in my chest. The weeks of observation, documentation, and preparation had led to this moment, yet I did not feel urgency or anger. I felt clarity. Her voice came through bright and casual, a tone meant to disarm, to soften. "Hi, Mom," she said. The words were simple, but I could hear the undertones, the unspoken hope that I would answer in kind, that I would engage as I always had. I let a pause linger, letting the silence stretch a space for intention and choice. "I'm calling to talk." Evelyn continued, a slight nervousness threading through her practiced ease. I placed the phone gently on the countertop, my thumb resting over the screen. I could hear her, but I did not respond. Every instinct to justify, to explain, to placate had been tempered by the knowledge that this conversation no longer needed me to play their game. I had reclaimed the narrative, and with it the boundaries that had been crossed for too long. Minutes stretched in measured quiet. Evelyn's voice wavered slightly, then grew firmer, repeating her attempt to engage. I exhaled slowly, the weight of weeks lifting in that controlled moment of refusal. When I finally pressed the screen to end the call, the action was deliberate, definitive. The line went dead. The sound of it clicking off was more than a signal of disconnection. It was a declaration, a boundary drawn firmly, a reclaiming of autonomy. I stepped onto the porch, the evening air cool against my skin. The house was quiet, the rooms behind me still and empty in the way I had grown to appreciate. I reached for the switch and turned on the porch light. The warm glow spilled across the steps and walkway, a tangible symbol of control, a marker that the space was now defined on my terms. I stood there for a long moment, watching the light settle over the yard, the shadows stretching across the lawn. The calm was deep and deliberate, not fragile or fleeting. It was a recognition of what had been lost, what had been endured, and what had been reclaimed. Evelyn's absence from the conversation was no longer a loss. It was proof that I could define the terms of connection, decide when to engage and when to protect the life I had rebuilt. The light remained on a steady presence against the night, a symbol of boundaries drawn, of lessons learned, and of the quiet power that comes from choosing when to speak and when to hang up.